week 14 of the fantasy football season. And here's a few kickers I have as sleepers this week. The first guy, Jason Sanders of the Miami Dolphins. So Sanders here, you would think he would score more points on a high-powered offense like Miami, but that really hasn't come to fruition this season. The last few games here for him, Week 10 versus Cleveland 5, Week 12 versus Houston 12, Week 13 at San Francisco 6, but this week a good matchup indoors at the Chargers that give up the 6 most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So Sanders available in 80% of fantasy leagues. This Dolphin offense, high-powered with Tua, Jalen Waddle, obviously, Tyreek Hill. And this week I think we'll get a few opportunities on Sunday Night Football in a potential shootout, and he's definitely a kicker I have as a sleeper this week. The next guy, Matthew Wright of the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's been on this list many times over the last couple weeks here, and it's very surprising to me. He's still available in 94% of fantasy leagues. He's a kicker that cracked my top 12 this week here, is Wright. And the last few weeks he's up there in fantasy points for the kicker position. Week 11 versus Cincinnati, 13. Week 12 in Indianapolis, 12 fantasy points. And Week 13, a monster ball game in Atlanta with 16 fantasy points. Over the last 3 weeks here, 41 fantasy points for Matthew Wright. Some wide receivers and running backs don't even have those numbers in the last few weeks. This week here, it's going to be a tight ball game once again versus the Baltimore Ravens. They give up the 17th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. But like I said, this Steeler offense, they don't punch a lot of balls in the end zone. Still with a young offense with Kenny Pickett running it. And this Raven defense, they're going to buckle down in the division ball game versus this Pittsburgh Steelers team. So right now, Matthew Wright out there, 94% of fantasy leagues, and have 41 fantasy points the last 3 weeks. He's definitely a sleeper this week. And the third and final kicker I have as a sleeper this week is Greg the Leg Zuerlein of the New York Jets. So Greg Zuerlein, another guy I've been talking about a lot this season here, and he's available right now in tons of fantasy leagues at 82%. So the last few games here for Greg the Leg: Week 9 versus Buffalo 9, Week 11 in New England 4, Week 12 versus Chicago 9, and then Week 13, a monster game in Minnesota, 18 fantasy points. So this week here, I know a tough matchup at the Buffalo Bills, but the Bills last time he versed them in Week 9 fantasy points for Greg the Leg. And this Jet offense, I know Mike White's in it. I know everyone is overreacting like he's the next big thing at the quarterback position in the NFL. But this Jet team, the last few weeks, have still had trouble punching a lot of balls into the end zone. And this week here versus one of the better defenses in the league at the Buffalo Bills, I think that's going to be the case once again. I think Zuerlein could go anywhere from 9 to 12 fantasy points. And he's definitely a kicker I have as a sleeper this week. So that's a few kickers I have as sleepers for Week 14 of the fantasy football season.